Thomas walked the path to the mill every morning, although no one had asked him to, and no duty required his presence there anymore. And in that quiet persistence, there was something that could not be explained by habit alone. The path had grown softer in recent days. Where snow had once hardened into ridges beneath boots and wheels, there was now damp earth that yielded slightly under his weight, holding the imprint of each step as if reluctant to let him pass unnoticed. Meltwater traced thin lines along the edges of the trail, glinting faintly in the pale light, while the air carried the mingled scent of thawing soil and cold river mist. Thomas moved slowly, leaning on his cane, not because he could not stand without it, but because age had taught him to measure distance differently. Years ago, he would have taken the rise in long strides, thinking of the day's work already waiting for him inside the mill. Now he paused halfway up the slope, not from exhaustion, but to look. From that spot, the river curved gently below, its surface broken where ice had fractured into dark seams. Beyond it lay the quiet fields, still winter pale, but no longer lifeless. And above them the sky stretched wide and colorless, holding the faintest warmth of a coming season. He always stopped there before climbing the final stretch. He did not think of it as farewell. Not yet. He simply looked at the mill the way one looks at an old companion whose face has changed, but whose presence remains deeply familiar. Thomas had not built the mill. He had not been its first keeper. The beams had already weathered decades before his hands ever touched them. Yet he had been the last to know it fully alive. He remembered the vibration of the floorboards when the stones were turning at full speed. He remembered the rhythm of the gears engaging, the steady hum that filled the space so completely that silence, when it finally came years later, had felt almost unnatural. He remembered lifting heavy sacks of grain with shoulders that did not yet ache, testing the grind with practiced fingers, adjusting the flow of water with a precision that had once seemed effortless. There had been days when the line of carts stretched all the way down the hill. Horses had snorted into the cold air, while men stamped their boots and women tucked shawls tighter around their shoulders, waiting their turn. Conversations had unfolded in fragments between the grinding of stone and the rush of water, and flour had drifted everywhere, settling into hair and eyebrows until everyone inside looked dusted in pale light. The mill had fed the village, not in grand gestures, not with ceremony, but daily, steadily, without asking to be noticed. Now it stood still. Thomas climbed the remaining steps and pushed the door open as he always did, letting it swing inward on hinges that creaked softly in protest. Inside, the air was cool, but no longer winter sharp, and thin bands of sunlight slipped through the windows, catching motes of dust that floated lazily in the quiet. He rested his palm against one of the great beams. The wood was rough beneath his skin, slightly damp from the season's shift, its surface bearing the marks of years, small cracks, darkened knots, the faint impressions where tools had once struck. There had been a time when the mill never knew silence. Now silence filled it completely, yet it did not feel empty. It felt waiting. Thomas moved toward the grinding stones and stood beside them, his hand lingering on the edge of the upper stone, as if expecting, even now, the faint vibration of movement. He did not close his eyes, yet he could hear it clearly. The deep, resonant hum of stone against stone, the soft rush of flour pouring into waiting sacks, the layered sound of river and mechanism working as one. Outside, the river broke free from another stretch of ice with a muted crack, and water surged forward, unrestrained. The mill did not respond. It no longer turned. But Thomas remained, standing between the memory of motion and the reality of stillness, knowing in a quiet way that this would be its final winter, and that he, more than anyone, would have to learn how to stand beside it without expecting it to move again. Elena had not walked the path to the mill in years. Yet when she turned toward the rise that morning, her steps followed it without hesitation, as though the ground itself remembered her weight and guided her forward. The thaw had softened everything. Snow lay in uneven patches along the edges of the fields, its surface dulled and sinking inward, while beneath it the earth darkened and breathed, releasing a scent that belonged neither to winter nor to spring, but to the fragile space between them. Small rivulets of meltwater slipped through the grass and gathered along the trail, reflecting a pale sky that seemed wider now that the air had cleared. She had heard the news like everyone else. Once the river was fully free of ice, the mill would be dismantled. The decision had come quietly, almost gently, spoken in practical tones about safety and cost and usefulness, and though no one had argued loudly against it, the words had settled into the village like a thin layer of frost, light but impossible to ignore. As Elena climbed the hill, she tried to remember the last time she had stood inside the mill while it was still alive with sound, and the memory rose not as a clear image, but as a sensation, vibration beneath her feet, warmth in the air, and the constant murmur of voices weaving themselves between the grinding stones. In her childhood, the mill had seemed enormous. The wheel had turned with a force that felt unstoppable, sending water cascading in glittering arcs back into the river. Inside, the stones had hummed with a deep, steady resonance that made her chest tremble when she stood too close. Flour had floated everywhere, soft and white, catching in her eyelashes and clinging to the fabric of her coat until she looked as though winter itself had brushed against her. She remembered clutching her mother's hand, both frightened and fascinated by the movement, by the rhythm that never faltered, by the way the miller, Thomas, though she had known him then simply as the man who belonged to the mill, moved among the machinery with calm assurance, adjusting levers and guiding grain as though the entire structure answered only to him. Back then, the mill had not merely stood by the river, it had ruled it. Now, as Elena reached the final stretch of the path, she slowed without meaning to. The building was smaller than she remembered, its wheel fixed in place, its wood darkened and weathered. The open sky seemed to press more closely against it, no longer interrupted by motion. She paused at the foot of the steps and listened. There was no grinding, no layered hum, only the river running free and the faint rustle of wind moving through bare branches along the bank. When she stepped inside, the shift from light to shadow made her blink. Dust drifted lazily in narrow beams of sunlight, and the air carried a faint scent of wood and old grain that had settled into the boards over decades. The great stones stood silent, their surfaces worn smooth by years of work, yet now cool and inert beneath the stillness. Thomas was there, standing near the window as though he had been expecting her, though neither of them had spoken of this meeting. "You remember it differently," he said after a moment, not turning fully toward her.
She did not answer at once, because memory is not a single thing. It is a layering of impressions that deepen over time. She remembered noise and movement, and the way her mother's laughter had sounded louder inside those walls. She remembered fear that had felt like awe. She remembered believing that nothing in the world could stop the turning of those stones. "It was larger," she finally replied, her voice soft in the quiet space, "and louder." Thomas inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging not the words themselves, but the truth beneath them. "It was alive," he said. Elena walked slowly across the floor, running her fingers along one of the beams. The wood felt rougher than she expected, as though time had lifted its surface grain and left it exposed. Yet beneath that roughness was strength, the kind that had endured storms and seasons without complaint. Outside, the river surged past the bank where ice once held it still. The sound carried clearly through the open door, and for a brief, almost disorienting moment, Elena imagined that if she stood very still, she might hear the mill respond. It did not. The wheel remained motionless against the brightening sky. Yet as she stood beside Thomas, surrounded by silence that felt heavier than sound, she realized that what she had truly come to find was not the turning of the stones, but the echo of who she had once been when they did. And in that echo, faint but unmistakable, the mill still lived.
Daniel did not climb the hill out of nostalgia. He had work to do that morning near the riverbank, checking the boundary posts that had shifted in the thaw. And when he noticed Thomas and Elena near the mill, he turned toward them more out of curiosity than sentiment. The path was muddy now, marked with boot prints that had softened at the edges, and he moved with the steady confidence of someone accustomed to uneven ground, not pausing to look back at the village or up at the sky. To him, the mill had never been alive in the way the older villagers described. He had been a child when its wheel last turned with any regularity, and even then the sound had been occasional, more a memory borrowed from others than something rooted in his own experience. What he knew of the mill came from stories told at tables in winter evenings, stories that seemed larger than the building itself. Standing before it now, Daniel saw structure. He saw beams that had warped slightly under years of weight. He saw joints that would require careful separation. He saw wood that, if handled well, could serve another generation in fences or barns. His gaze moved along the frame with a craftsman's practicality, assessing angles and connections, calculating what would hold and what would not. There was no disrespect in his view, only clarity. "Once the ground dries," he said as he stepped inside, wiping a trace of mud against the threshold, "it won't take long to take it down." His voice carried evenly through the interior, and though he did not intend it so, the words seemed to rest heavily in the quiet air. Thomas turned toward him, not sharply, but with the measured attention of someone who understood that youth speaks in the language of continuation rather than preservation. "It stood longer than most of us," Thomas replied. Daniel nodded, accepting the fact without embellishment. "And now it doesn't need to." Elena watched the exchange from near the window, aware that neither man was wrong. One measured life in what had been sustained, the other measured it in what could be built next. Between them stood the mill, no longer turning, no longer humming, yet still holding the weight of both perspectives. Daniel walked toward the grinding stones and ran his hand lightly across their surface, feeling the smoothness worn by years of friction. He imagined the effort required to move them,
to transport them, to decide whether they were worth keeping at all. His mind worked forward, not backward. Outside, the river surged freely, the last sheets of ice having broken away entirely. Sunlight struck the water in shifting patterns, bright and restless, and in that movement there was a promise that Daniel recognized instinctively. He belonged to that motion, to what followed. And yet, as Thomas began to speak of the years when carts lined the hill and the stones never rested, Daniel listened more carefully than before. The details were not exaggerated, they were specific, textured with memory. He could almost see the flour drifting in the air, almost hear the layered sound of water and stone working together. For the first time, the mill began to shift in his mind. It was still wood, still beams and weight and aging joints, but it was also something else, an axis around which other lives had once turned. Daniel stepped back toward the doorway and looked out at the river, at the sky widening over the valley, and he understood that dismantling the mill would not erase what had happened within it. It would not silence the years that had already been lived there. The wheel no longer moved, the stones no longer sang, but the hill still gathered people, still held their stories, still framed the river in the same way it always had. Daniel saw wood, Thomas saw time, Elena saw herself as she had once been. And between them, in the late light of a winter nearly ended, the old mill stood suspended between memory and motion, waiting for the season to complete what had already begun.
In the days that followed, word spread without effort that people had begun walking up to the mill again, not because it was needed, not because grain required grinding, but because something in the nearing end of winter drew them there with a quiet insistence that felt older than reason. They did not arrive in crowds. They came in pairs or alone, pausing at the rise as if to measure the silhouette against the sky before stepping closer. The river had fully claimed its course now, the ice gone, the current steady and deep, and its sound carried up the slope in a continuous murmur that seemed to thread through every conversation. Thomas was there most afternoons, seated on an overturned crate near the wall, his cane resting against a beam that had supported more weight than most men ever would. Elena came often as well, sometimes bringing bread wrapped in cloth, placing it on the same rough surface where sacks of grain had once waited their turn. Daniel, though less frequent, found himself lingering longer each time he passed, listening rather than speaking. It began with small recollections. A man remembered the winter when snow had piled so high against the door that they had to shovel their way inside before the stones could turn. A woman laughed softly at the memory of her father misjudging the measure of grain and scattering flour across the floor, only to be met with Thomas's calm assurance that nothing had been lost that could not be gathered again. The stories did not compete, they layered. One voice would begin, hesitant at first, and another would join, correcting a date, adding a detail, recalling the smell of damp wool coats and warm grain. Someone described the way the mill had sounded at night, when only a single lantern burned and the river seemed louder than usual, and in that description the quiet interior seemed to fill again with movement. Elena spoke of the first time she had been allowed to carry a small sack on her own, her pride far greater than the weight she bore. She remembered how the floor had trembled beneath her boots, how the steady hum of the stones had seemed like a living thing,
and how, for a moment, she had believed the mill would always stand exactly as it was. Thomas listened more than he spoke, yet when he did speak, the details emerged with careful precision. He described adjusting the sluice gate during spring floods, feeling the pressure of the river shift beneath the wheel. He recalled the years when harvests were thin and the line at the door stretched into dusk, and he worked until his shoulders ached so that no family would go without flour before morning. Daniel stood near the doorway, his back against the frame, watching how the beams seemed to hold these voices differently than silence. He had always understood structures in terms of support and balance, but now he began to see that the mill had held more than timber and stone. It had held time, and through time it had held people together. The light inside shifted as the afternoon wore on, sliding slowly across the worn floorboards, catching in the grooves left by years of movement. Dust rose in thin spirals, illuminated briefly before fading back into the dimness, as if even the air itself remembered. Outside, the river moved without pause. Inside, the mill stood quiet. Yet in the soft weaving of memory and voice, it felt once again like the center of something steady and shared, as though its final season had drawn not grain, but recollection, gathering the village around it one last time before the wood would be separated and the shape dissolved. And in that gathering, beneath beams darkened by decades of weather and work, the old mill was not merely awaiting dismantling, it was being remembered.
The decision had not arrived like a storm. It had not fractured the village into argument or accusation, nor had it been announced with the weight of finality that demands resistance. Instead, it had formed gradually, almost invisibly, in the quiet arithmetic of passing years, in the growing distance between necessity and sentiment, in the steady realization that what once stood at the center of daily life had drifted to its edge. At first, the mill had paused. Then it had slowed. Then, without ceremony, it had fallen still. Grain traveled now to the town beyond the hills, where modern machines worked with a speed and precision that required no waiting under open eaves and no long conversations while sacks changed hands. Flour returned in neat parcels, predictable and clean, and the practical ease of it made complaint feel indulgent. The council gathered on an evening that smelled faintly of damp earth and thawing ground. Windows were cracked open to let in the cool air, and the murmur of the river could be heard even in the meeting hall, as if the valley itself wished to be present for the conversation. Safety was mentioned, maintenance, the weakening of beams, the cost of restoring something no longer required. No one raised their voice. No one demanded preservation at any price. Thomas sat toward the back, listening not with anger, but with the still attentiveness of a man who understands that time rarely reverses itself. Elena sat a few rows ahead, her hands folded in her lap, aware that the arguments were reasonable, that no one spoke carelessly, and yet feeling the quiet pressure of something that could not be measured in expense. Daniel spoke briefly, his tone respectful and steady. He did not dismiss the past, nor did he cling to it. He spoke of safety
and of new uses for old wood, of making something durable from what had already served well. His words did not cut, they bridged. When the vote was taken, it was neither unanimous nor divided sharply. It simply passed, as decisions often do when no clear injustice stands in the way. Once the river had fully cleared and the ground dried enough to bear weight, the mill would be dismantled. Outside, twilight gathered over the valley. The sky shifted from pale gray to a deeper blue, and the first star appeared above the dark line of trees. People stepped out into the cool evening without lingering, each carrying a version of the outcome shaped by their own years. Thomas walked home slowly, not because the decision had surprised him, but because the finality of it required space to settle. He did not think in terms of defeat. He thought instead of seasons. The mill had endured storms and drought, abundance and scarcity, and now it would endure this as well, though in a different form. Elena paused at the bend in the road, where the rise to the mill could still be seen against the dimming sky. The wheel stood motionless, silhouetted against fading light, and for a moment she imagined the hum of stone and water rising again, not as it was, but as it lived in memory. Daniel, walking in the opposite direction, glanced once toward the hill and then ahead to the fields beyond. In his stride there was no urgency, only continuity. To him, the valley did not shrink with the loss of a structure. It shifted, making room for what followed. The river moved steadily through the dark. The mill remained where it had always been, unchanged for the moment, yet already altered by knowledge. The decision had been made, and like the thaw itself, it could not be undone, only lived through, one measured day at a time.
The morning chosen for the dismantling arrived without ceremony, as though the valley itself refused to distinguish it from any other early spring day. A pale sun rose through a thin veil of cloud, casting a gentle brightness across the fields where snow had nearly vanished, leaving behind dark soil that glistened faintly with moisture. The air held that particular clarity that comes at the end of winter, cool but no longer biting, touched with the scent of river water running free. By mid-morning, a small truck made its way up the path, its tires pressing deep into the soft ground. The sound of its engine did not shatter the quiet. It blended into it, joining the murmur of water and the occasional call of birds that had returned to the trees along the bank. Thomas was already there. He had opened the door as he had done so many times before, stepping inside not as a worker, but as a witness. He moved slowly across the floor, touching the beams with deliberate care, as though committing their grain to memory through his fingertips. He did not speak to the men who arrived with tools. There was no need. They greeted him with a nod that carried more respect than words could have held. Elena climbed the hill soon after, carrying a small basket as she had done in the days before, though today she set it down near the wall without unwrapping its contents. She stood beside Thomas for a while, both of them looking not at each other, but at the interior that had shaped so many seasons of their lives. Daniel came last, having already spoken with the workers below. His steps were steady, purposeful,
Yet there was something in his gaze that had softened since the first day he stood within those walls. He moved through the space with the quiet attentiveness of someone who now understood that he was not merely dismantling wood, but participating in a transition. The first sound of separation was subtle. A bolt loosened, a hinge lifted free. The great wheel, which had once answered to water with relentless motion, was steadied by careful hands before being lowered. It did not crash, it did not splinter. It descended with restraint, guided as though the men handling it felt the weight of more than timber. When the wheel touched the ground, the sky seemed suddenly wider. Light entered the structure differently, spilling across beams that had long been shadowed by its presence. The change was not violent, it was architectural, as if the mill were quietly rearranging itself before dissolving. Inside, the grinding stones remained in place for a time, their surfaces cool and silent. Thomas approached them once more and rested his palm against the worn edge, recalling the vibration that had once pulsed through his bones when they turned. He did not attempt to hear that sound again. Instead, he listened to the river beyond the doorway, its steady current replacing what had been lost. Elena watched as planks were lifted and stacked carefully aside. She noticed how the wood caught the sunlight, revealing patterns in the grain that had gone unseen for years. In their separation, the beams seemed lighter, almost relieved of their long burden. Daniel worked alongside the others, his movements efficient but unhurried. At one point he paused, looking across the valley where green hints had begun to break through the soil. He understood now that what he was helping to end was not erased, but absorbed into memory, into stories, into the landscape itself. By afternoon, the shape of the mill had changed beyond recognition. Where walls once enclosed shadow and sound, there was open air. Where the wheel had framed the river, there was only sky and water moving unimpeded. Yet nothing about the scene felt broken. The dismantled beams lay in ordered stacks. The stones waited to be moved. The hill remained. The river continued, and the light, clear and steady, rested over everything with quiet impartiality. As the sun lowered toward evening, the last of the major supports was removed. The structure no longer stood. And still the valley did not seem emptier. It seemed expanded. The river ran on, untroubled by what had changed above it. The final day had passed without spectacle, and in its measured unfolding, the old mill had not been destroyed, but transformed. Its wood ready for new use, its form dissolved into air and memory, its presence shifting from matter into something less visible, yet no less real.
That evening, when the last of the tools had been loaded, and the truck's sound faded down the softened road, the hill did not feel empty so much as newly exposed, as though something long held in place had been gently lifted, allowing the sky to settle closer to the earth. The ground where the mill had stood was still marked by impressions, darker rectangles in the soil where beams had rested, faint outlines where the weight of stone had pressed into wood for decades. Nothing had yet grown over these signs. They lay open, visible, as though the land itself required time to adjust to its altered shape. Thomas returned just before dusk. He had not planned to, and yet his feet carried him up the rise without conscious decision,
following the path that had guided him for most of his life. Without the mill's silhouette, the horizon seemed wider, and for a moment he felt the subtle disorientation that comes when a familiar landmark disappears, even though the ground beneath one's feet remains the same. He stopped where the doorway once stood. There was no threshold now, no hinge, no frame to pass through. The river lay directly before him, unobstructed, its surface reflecting the pale glow of the descending sun. The current moved steadily, without reference to what had changed above it. He listened. The absence of grinding stone was no longer silence, it was clarity. The river's voice, once layered beneath mechanical rhythm, now carried alone, fuller and more intricate than he had ever noticed before. It sounded less like loss and more like continuation. Elena joined him shortly after, her steps quieter than usual, as if she feared disturbing something fragile. She did not stand beside him immediately, but a little to the side, gazing across the open space where beams had once intersected in familiar patterns. "It feels different," she said, though she did not specify whether she meant the hill or herself. Thomas nodded. "It feels lighter." The word did not deny what had been removed, it acknowledged what had been released. Daniel approached last, carrying one of the smaller planks under his arm. He had taken it not as a trophy, but as a piece of work yet to be shaped. He paused before them, glancing from the river to the cleared ground. "It will make a good bench," he said quietly, almost to himself. Elena smiled faintly, imagining that bench placed beneath the new openness of sky, perhaps near the water where the wheel once turned. In her mind, the mill did not vanish. It rearranged itself, spreading outward into the village rather than rising above it. As dusk deepened, the valley shifted into blue and silver tones. The last light caught on the river's surface, then faded, leaving only the steady flow of water beneath a widening canopy of stars. Without the mill's shadow, the night sky appeared larger than before. Thomas looked upward, following the line where the wheel once cut across the horizon, and for the first time since the decision had been made, he felt no pull toward what had stood there. Instead, he sensed the quiet truth that nothing essential had been taken from him. The structure was gone. The work was finished. Yet the years remained. They lingered in the rhythm of his breath, in the memory of vibration beneath his feet, in the stories already spoken and those yet to be told. The mill had not resisted its ending. It had completed it. Beside them, the river moved steadily through the dark, indifferent to dismantled wood and altered skylines, carrying fragments of winter downstream and making room for spring. The night after did not mourn. It expanded, and under that widened sky, where beams no longer framed the view and the air felt newly open, the absence of the old mill revealed not a void, but a broader horizon in which memory and motion could exist side by side.
By the next morning, the valley had already begun the quiet work of forgetting the shape of what once stood upon the hill. Mist lifted slowly from the river, rising in pale ribbons that caught the early light before dissolving into the widening sky. The ground where the mill had rested appeared darker than the surrounding slope, the soil pressed flat and bare, yet even there small shoots of green had begun to push upward,
tentative but certain, as if the earth recognized no permanent absence. Thomas walked the path again, though this time there was no structure waiting at the top to greet him. The climb felt different, not because it was steeper, but because his eyes no longer searched for the outline of beams against the horizon. Instead, the view opened fully, uninterrupted, and he found himself noticing details that had long gone unseen. The subtle bend of the river further downstream, the way the light pooled along its edges, the faint shimmer of young grass where snow had receded. He stopped where the doorway once had been. There was no need to step inside. There was no inside. The air moved freely across the rise, unimpeded by walls or wheel, and in that movement there was no sense of violation, only continuity. Elena joined him later in the morning, carrying nothing this time, her hands empty and relaxed at her sides. She stood beside him and looked not at what was gone, but at the water, bright and restless in the sunlight. "It doesn't feel empty," she said after a while. Thomas considered her words carefully. "No," he agreed, "it feels open." Below them, Daniel worked near the riverbank, measuring and marking a place where a small bench might stand. The plank he had carried the night before now rested against a post, its surface sanded smooth, its grain illuminated in honey-colored light. When he lifted it into position, the wood did not protest. It seemed almost to accept its altered purpose. The sound of hammer against nail carried upward, clear and deliberate, blending with bird song and the steady rush of water. It was a different rhythm from the grinding of stone, lighter and more measured, yet it belonged to the same landscape. As the bench took shape, Thomas watched with a calm that surprised even him. He realized that what he had feared losing had not been the building itself, but the sense of center it once provided. Now, standing on the cleared hill, he understood that the center had shifted rather than vanished. The mill had gathered the village around grain and labor. This open space gathered them around memory and sky. Children would climb this rise again, not to watch a wheel turn, but to sit and look at the river. Stories would be told from the bench built of old timber, and in those stories the mill would still stand, complete and resonant, even if no beam marked its outline. The morning grew warmer as the sun rose higher, and with it came the unmistakable scent of spring, wet earth giving way to growth, water running clear and strong, air no longer carrying the sting of frost. The hill no longer held a structure, it held possibility. Thomas took one last look across the valley, not searching for what had been removed, but absorbing what remained. The river flowed as it always had. The fields awaited planting. The sky stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon. Winter had ended. The mill had followed, and in their passing they had made room for something wider, something that did not erase the past, but carried it forward in quieter, less visible forms. As the weeks unfolded and spring gathered strength, the hill where the mill had once stood began to settle into its altered shape, not with reluctance, but with the quiet patience that belongs to land rather than to people. Grass rose where beams had rested. Wind moved freely across the slope, unbroken by wheel or wall. The bench Daniel had built from the old timber found its place near the river's edge, positioned where one could sit and watch the current sweep past in long silver ribbons beneath the sun. At first, villagers still glanced upward out of habit, their eyes searching for the familiar silhouette that no longer divided sky from water. But gradually that instinct softened, replaced not by indifference, but by acceptance. The absence ceased to demand attention. It became part of the view. Thomas took to sitting on the bench in the late afternoons, his cane resting against the wood that had once supported the mill's weight. From there he could see the river fully, unobstructed, its surface flashing with light in ways he had never noticed when the great wheel cast its shadow across the water. He no longer listened for the hum of stone. He listened for the river itself. Elena came often as well, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, and when she spoke of the mill now, she did not describe its dismantling. She described the winter mornings when flour hung in the air like pale mist, the steady vibration beneath her childhood boots, the sense that something dependable and enduring anchored the village to its work. Daniel, passing with tools slung over his shoulder, would sometimes pause long enough to sit beside them. He did not speak much of the structure that had stood there. Instead, he listened, and in listening, he understood that the mill had not been defined solely by timber and mechanism, but by the lives that had moved through it. Seasons shifted, the fields turned green. Children ran across the hill, where once they would have been warned to keep clear of the turning wheel. They did not see what had stood there. They saw only open space and sky. Yet when stories were told, when Thomas spoke of long winters and relentless work, when Elena described the scent of grain and warm wood, the children imagined it vividly enough that for a moment the mill rose again in their minds, complete and resonant. The river never altered its course. It had turned the wheel when the mill was strong, and it flowed now just the same, indifferent yet faithful. In its steady motion there was no mourning, no triumph, only continuation. It carried fragments of winter downstream and reflected the widening light of spring without preference. And perhaps that was the truest inheritance of the old mill. It had stood for decades beside a river that never ceased, and in doing so it had taught the village something quiet and enduring, that usefulness may fade, that structures may yield to time, but the meaning woven through shared labor and memory does not dissolve so easily. Where beams had intersected, sky now opened. Where grinding stones had turned, grass now grew. Yet the hill was not emptier, it was simply wider. Thomas understood this fully one evening as he watched the sun lower toward the horizon, its light laying a path across the water. He realized that what had ended was not erased, and what had been dismantled had not been diminished. The mill lived now in recollection, in wood shaped into new forms, in stories carried forward by those who had stood beneath its beams. The river moved steadily on. Spring settled over the valley, and where the old mill had once turned against the current, the open air now held something just as enduring, the quiet knowledge that endings, when met without resistance, often reveal not loss, but space for continuation.
Thank you for spending this evening with us. If this story left you feeling warm, support the video with a like and share a few words in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to return to stories around the campfire.